Act 2. New Perspectives. Culturally, this had become a major topic after the gay rights movement launched into the mainstream in the 1970s. The 1980s brought one step forward and two steps back. The rise of the religious right in the Reagan era meant that the gay rights agenda was stalled out, and Democrats often walked away from this issue. Secondly, the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s reprioritized the LGBTQ movement to survival and added even greater stigma to these identities. But there was one step forward with psychologists. That brings us to 1987. R. Jan Stout's foundational article, Sin and Sexuality, Psychobiology and the Development of Homosexuality. It's a reminder just how important psychology and psychologists were for mediating these early debates. I go into more depth on this history in my book, but I want to point out that Stout's article is actually pretty transformative. It really was groundbreaking in LDS print media. He talks about how he believed and presented publicly theories on the cause and cure of homosexuality following Freudian psychology in 1970. 16 years later, he states, I can state that what I presented was wrong and simplistic. The evolving change in my views came by examining new research, gaining more clinical experience, and looking for alternative explanations to clarify some of the mystery surrounding the development of human sexuality, and specifically homosexuality. Stout's overview provides a guide to the updated psychological research from the 1970s and 80s that overturned earlier consensus on the pathologization of homosexuality and on whether it can be cured. He tackles the ethical and moral issues with forced celibacy, but leaves the question open as a mystery of paradox for how to proceed on this topic, warning against extremes on all sides. In fall of 1993, T.J. O'Brien wrote, You are not alone, a plea for understanding the homosexual condition. O'Brien was a gay man, and this essay addresses how church members should treat LGBTQ members. He points to Jan Stout's article, among other influential pieces that were beginning to soften LDS attitudes and change practices in the early 1990s. But he also notes several examples of terrible things that LDS members were still saying and doing, including an infamous homophobic rant from Orson Scott Card in Sunstone magazine in 1990. The early 1990s is also the birth of Evergreen, a change therapy support group that lasted until the early 2010s. And O'Brien offers some reflections on them and other claims to have been cured. Just as psychologists were starting to question these methods, testimonials from ex-gay men and women were aggressively marketed through various LDS and non-LDS ministries. This essay is really an important look at the culture of the 1990s, the kind of stereotypes and popular assumptions LGBTQ members faced, and a great overview of the science and culture wars up to that point. He spends a lot of time answering the idea that the standards for heterosexuals and homosexuals are the same. Rather than a cure, many liberal Mormons were promoting lifelong celibacy as the solution. How ironic, he says, that for years homosexuality was believed to be caused by a lack of affectionate bonding in childhood, and now the prescribed remedy is more of the cause: isolation. Does it not seem hypocritical for happily married heterosexuals to insist that homosexuals spend their lives on this earth devoid of the deep love and compassion so rewarding and treasured by heterosexuals? He tells his own story of seeking a cure and its failure. Honestly, reading this sometimes felt a little dated. It's nearly 30 years old, but mostly it could have been written today. Quote, I am not so naive as to believe my words will put a stop to prejudice or ignorance. These will continue to surface. It will take time for many people to see in homosexuality much more than mere sexual involvement. My hope is that these observations may somehow serve the small percentage of our people who are dealing with sexual feelings natural to them but different from those of their peers. Perhaps the remarks of one who has dealt with such issues will help them to face trials and conflicts which the world will, out of concern, but with limited understanding, put on them. There are also new historical articles that are exploring this question that show up in the 1990s. D. Michael Quinn was a pioneer on this topic, and in the winter 1995 issue, he published Male-Male Intimacy Among 19th Century Mormons, a Case Study. This was a prelude to his book-length treatment, Same-Sex Dynamics in 19th Century America, A Mormon Example, that looked at intimacy broadly defined before the rise of homophobia in the post-World War II era. It's a fascinating study of changing norms and practices that allowed once for a huge range of bonding practices between people of the same sex. Quinn himself had come out in the course of researching this article and book a few years before, and this work remains influential. Okay, now there's an article here that I confess that I just discovered last year, despite having worked and researched in this area for years, and honestly, it surprised me, though I'm not sure why in retrospect. The issue was bound to have been raised. In the fall 1998, just a few years after the Family Proclamation, Gary Watts wrote The Logical Next Step, Affirming Same-Sex Relationships. He notes the inner conflict that gay LDS members faced, having to choose between their desires to have a relationship and their desires to be in the church. It's not a super rigorous study, but it draws on a lot of personal experience and conversation to assess the issues. And he proposes that affirming committed, monogamous, same-sex relationships would not change doctrines about reserving sexual intimacy for marriage, but proposed that these relationships would not be eligible for sealings. The next essay I want to address in this category comes from our own Bob Rees, former editor at Dialogue and a longtime activist and advocate on this issue. His fall 2000 article is titled, In a Dark Time, the Eye Begins to See, Personal Reflections on Homosexuality Among the Mormons at the Beginning of a New Millennium. A straight man and local LDS leader, Rees shares his own experience counseling with LGBTQ members and their struggles from gay bashing, most famously to the murder of Matthew Shepard, to prejudice and more. Rees talks about his own changed perspectives on this issue that started when he was a singles ward bishop in Los Angeles in the 1980s and shares what he had learned along the way. In rereading this essay, I noticed something I hadn't known before. Rees refers to his friend Stuart Mattis, then an active gay man who was willing to work with others about maintaining their faith and sexuality. Bishop Rees, Mattis reportedly said, the reason I don't like the word homosexual is that the sexuality part is not the most important part of what I want. I want an intimate, loving relationship like my mother and father have. For those who know, Stuart Mattis tragically took his life on the steps of an LDS chapel in Los Angeles in February 2000 in protest of the church's political efforts against same-sex marriage in California. Rees calls for a number of steps and changes as a body of the church to improve these conditions. These were dark times indeed. In this same issue, Hugo Oliaz interviews two important figures in LDS LGBTQ organizing, a former director of affirmation and the founder of Gay LDS Youth, a group that briefly flourished in the early 2000s, but I'm not sure what happened to it after that. A great resource for learning more about LDS LGBTQ organizing during this period. So we can see that among the changing ideas during this era was an increase of what I call pastoral efforts to soften attitudes, encourage more understanding and acceptance, and make new options for life within the faith besides therapy and change. But these were coming alongside changes in the psychological literature as well. From the 1980s to the early 2000s, we see this emergent pushback that came from empathetic recognition of harms, including the loss of lives.
This is Linda Hoffman-Kimball of the Dialogue Foundation Board.
This is Aaron Brown.
I am Chris Kimball.
My name is Dalen Amasimaku, board member of the Dialogue Foundation.
For nearly 2 centuries, the Mormon tradition has produced a proud corpus of thought and culture.
For the last 50 years, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, has been the primary repository for the best of that tradition.
As individuals have attempted to find new ways to be both Mormon and modern, Dialogue has provided the arena in which these conversations could take place.
Dialogue's board of directors has made the decision to make all of the journal's content free the moment it is published.
While we are fortunate to be in a position to make this transition, we are asking for your help so we can continue to do so for the next 50 years.
Traditional readers can still subscribe to our quarterly print journal, but we also have a new donation model that allows readers to pledge a particular amount per month to support Dialogue's mission.
Go to dialoguejournal.com/subscribe to pass along the gift of Dialogue's deep, thoughtful analysis to a new generation of readers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.